The air in the town council hall on October 12, 1876, was thick with the scent of wet wool, pipe smoke, and self-satisfaction. Outside, a bitter autumn rain lashed against the tall, mullioned windows of the Providence Falls Municipal Building, a grim overture to the winter everyone knew was coming. The almanacs, the old-timers, and the ache in arthritic joints all agreed. It would be a season of brutal, unforgiving cold. Inside, Alara Vance stood before the three men who constituted the town's entire governing body. She was 16 years old. She was a widow of 4 months, her husband, a kind young man named Thomas, having been taken by a logging accident in late May. She was an orphan, her parents lost to cholera when she was a child. She was, by every measure the town of Providence Falls used, utterly alone and without recourse. Her cabin, a hastily constructed shack on the edge of town, was already proving to be a sieve against the wind and rain. It would not survive a hard frost, let alone the blizzards that were the region's grim signature. "I am not asking for charity, sirs," Alara said, her voice steady and clear, a stark contrast to the shuffling papers and gruff coughs of the men before her. "I am asking for permission, and for the right to salvage stone from the North Quarry." Alderman Croft, a man whose girth was a testament to his prosperity and whose face was a permanent mask of stern disapproval, peered down at her over his spectacles. "Permission for what, child? To build another drafty shack that will send you to the church for handouts come January?" "No, sir," Alara replied, her hands clasped behind her back to still their trembling. "I intend to build a winter home, a proper one. I have the plans, drawn from my grandfather's journals." Mr. Blackwood, the owner of the lumber mill and a man who saw the world as a collection of bored feet, chuckled dryly. "Journals? We build with timber and sweat here, miss, not with ink and sentiment. There is no lumber allocated for your project. The town's resources are for families, for established homesteads." His implication was clear. She was neither. "I will not require lumber, Mr. Blackwood. Not for the walls," she stated. "I will build into the earth, between the twin stone faces of the Grayback Ravine. The walls will be stone. The roof will be angled south, and it will be glazed with glass." The third man, Mr. Gable of the General Mercantile, let out a short, sharp laugh. "A hole in the ground? You want to live like a badger? And with glass? Do you have any idea the cost of pane glass? It would take a king's ransom to cover a roof." "I have the funds for the glass," Alara said, her chin rising a fraction. "Thomas left me $47 in silver coins. I have calculated the cost. It will be $27 for the panes and the linseed putty. I will have $20 remaining for provisions." She had calculated it 100 times, the numbers a desperate prayer in her mind. Alderman Croft removed his spectacles and polished them with a linen handkerchief, a gesture of profound and patronizing patience. "Child, your grief has addled your senses. People do not live in ditches. We build our homes to stand tall, to face the elements with strong timber frames and pitched roofs to shed the snow. It is the way it has always been done. It is the proper, God-fearing way." "My grandfather was an engineer in the old country," Alara pressed, her voice gaining an edge of urgency. "He studied thermodynamics. He wrote that the earth itself is a reservoir of heat. Below the frost line, the ground maintains a stable temperature. By building down into the earth, you are not fighting the cold, you are using the planet's own warmth. The stone walls will act as a thermal mass, absorbing the sun's heat during the day through the glass and radiating it back through the night. It is a proven principle." Mr. Blackwood scoffed. "Thermal what?" "We are simple, practical men, miss. We do not have time for such fanciful theories. We have a town to prepare for winter. Your request is denied. The quarry stone is for town projects. Your husband's credit at the mill is exhausted. I suggest you speak with the pastor about finding a family to take you in as a maid. The dismissal was absolute. There was no appeal. Alara looked from one closed face to the next. She saw no empathy, no curiosity, only the rigid certainty of men who had never had to question the way things were done, because the way things were done had always worked for them. She gave a single, sharp nod, turned without another word, and walked out of the hall. The heavy oak door closed behind her with a sound of finality, shutting out the warm, smoky air and returning her to the cold, biting rain. They thought they had given her a final verdict. They were wrong. It was a declaration of war against the coming winter, a war she would have to fight alone. The next morning, October 13th, Alara sold the last of her mother's heirlooms, a silver locket and a pair of matching earrings, to a traveling merchant for $6. It was a pittance, but it was enough. With that money, she purchased a sturdy wheelbarrow, a new shovel head, 2 pickaxes, and a dozen hardened steel chisels from a blacksmith in the next county, avoiding Mr. Gable's store entirely. She had her $47 from Thomas tucked away, reserved solely for the glass and provisions. This new capital, earned from the ghost of her mother, was for the tools of her survival. The Grayback Ravine was a place most townsfolk avoided. It was a deep, narrow scar in the landscape 2 miles north of town, carved by some ancient, forgotten river. Its sides were sheer faces of granite, running parallel to each other and separated by a gap of precisely 12 feet. The ravine floor was littered with fallen rock and scrub, but it was sheltered from the prevailing northwesterly winds. Crucially, the ravine was oriented almost perfectly east to west, meaning one granite face was exposed to the southern sun for the entire day. It was here, in this shunned and desolate place, that Alara would make her stand. Her work began not with stone, but with earth. She marked out a rectangle on the ravine floor, 40 feet long and 12 feet wide, stretching from one granite wall to the other. Then she began to dig. The work was brutal, a relentless assault on soil, clay, and embedded rock. Her hands, accustomed to mending and cooking, were soon raw, blistered, and bleeding. She worked from the first hint of dawn until the last rays of light faded from the sky, her small frame a study in relentless motion. The town, when it noticed at all, dismissed her efforts as Vance's folly. Men on their way to hunting grounds would sometimes pause at the ravine's edge and shout down jokes, their laughter echoing off the stone walls that were to be her salvation. She never answered. She just kept digging. Each shovelful of earth was a small victory. Each rock pried loose was a testament to her will. She learned the rhythm of the work, the way to use her body's weight to drive the pickaxe deep, the precise angle to lever a stubborn boulder free. The pile of excavated earth grew into a massive berm at the western end of her pit, which she meticulously shaped and packed down. This, her grandfather's journal explained, was not waste. It was a crucial part of the design, a barrier that would deflect the wind that might otherwise funnel down the ravine's length. By the end of the first week, the pit was 4 feet deep. The town's mockery began to curdle into a kind of morbid curiosity. Mr. Blackwood himself rode out on his horse, peering down at her from the precipice. "You're still at this foolishness?" he called down, his voice dripping with condescension. "You'll catch your death of cold in that ditch before you ever finish it." Alara paused, leaning on her shovel, and looked up. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair matted with sweat, but her eyes were clear and defiant. "The cold is why I'm digging, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice even. "You should know. Your new house has a stone foundation, does it not? Dug into the earth to keep the floors from freezing." He had no answer to that, and rode off with a disgruntled snort. She had to solve the problem of the quarry stone. The town council had forbidden her from taking it, but her grandfather's design was predicated on using thick-cut stone for the north, east, and west walls of her sunken structure. The southern face would be glass, but the other three needed to be bastions of thermal mass. For 2 days she wrestled with the problem, her digging slowed by uncertainty. Then she found the answer. It was not in the town's quarry, but in the ravine itself. Centuries of rockfalls had littered the base of the cliffs with thousands of tons of granite, much of it already fractured into manageable, if irregular, pieces. It was not the neat, quarried block she had hoped for, but it was stone, it was mass, and it was free. This new phase of the project was even more demanding. She had to identify suitable rocks, some weighing hundreds of pounds, and painstakingly maneuver them into place. She used a system of levers made from fallen timber, fulcrums of smaller stones, and sheer, unyielding effort. She discovered the principles of leverage and mechanics not from a book, but through the burning protest of her muscles and the sharp reality of a slipping stone. She had no mortar, so she adopted another ancient technique described in the journal: dry stone stacking. She carefully selected and fitted the stones together, using smaller chinking stones to fill the gaps and lock the larger ones in place. The process was agonizingly slow, like solving a puzzle where every piece was a back-breaking weight. She built the north wall directly against the sheer granite face of the ravine, making the cliff itself the outer layer of her home. This was a critical design choice, directly coupling her dwelling to the immense thermal stability of the bedrock. The east and west walls were built in the same painstaking manner, rising from the floor of her excavation. She left openings for a door on the east wall and for a small ventilation chimney on the west. By mid-November, the first snows had dusted the higher peaks. The air had a new, sharper bite. The town was abuzz with final winter preparations. Wagons loaded with firewood rumbled through the streets, and the smell of wood smoke was a constant presence. Ilara's pit was now 16 feet deep at the northern wall, sloping upwards to 8 feet at the southern edge. The 3 stone walls were complete, their rough-hewn faces a testament to her 40 days of unceasing labor. The structure was now a reality, a tangible thing that could no longer be dismissed as mere fancy. The laughter from the townsfolk had mostly ceased, replaced by a grudging, baffled silence. They still thought her mad, but they could no longer deny her industry. Now came the most technical part of the construction, the roof. According to the journals, the angle was paramount. It had to be angled to be perfectly perpendicular to the sun's rays at the winter solstice, maximizing the solar gain. For her latitude, that was an angle of approximately 30 degrees. She used a simple water level and a protractor Thomas had owned to get the measurements precise. The roof joists were not the thick-milled beams from Blackwood's mill, but straight, strong pine trees she felled herself from a stand outside the town's official lumber territory. She stripped them of their bark and laboriously notched them to fit onto the stone walls and a single, heavy ridge beam. On November 20th, she walked into Providence Falls. Her hands were calloused and scarred, her face weathered by wind and sun, but she walked with a straight-backed purpose that made people step aside. She went directly to Mr. Gable's mercantile. He watched her approach with a wary eye. "I am here to purchase the glass," she announced, placing the small, heavy cloth bag of silver coins on the counter. The sound they made was a sharp, definitive clink. $27 worth. The manifest says you have 24-inch by 36-inch panes. Gable was taken aback. He, like everyone else, had assumed her plan would have failed by now, that she would have come begging for shelter, not to make the single largest purchase of glass he would have all year. He reluctantly counted the coins, his skepticism warring with his greed. "It's your money to waste," he muttered, writing up the bill of sale. No refunds when your glass house freezes over and shatters. Transporting the precious cargo was a nerve-wracking ordeal. She paid a boy with a sturdy cart 50 cents to help her move the heavy crates to the ravine's edge. From there, she carried each pane down a makeshift ramp into the structure one by one, her heart pounding with each step. The glazing took 3 full days. She set each pane into the wooden roof frame, sealing it meticulously with the linseed oil putty she had also purchased. When she was finished, the entire southern face of her structure was a wall of glass, angled towards the pale winter sun. The effect inside was breathtaking. Even with the low-hanging sun of late autumn, the interior was flooded with light. The rough stone walls seemed to glow, and the air within was already noticeably warmer and stiller than the biting wind outside. She had built a great, passive solar collector. She stood in the center of the space, a cavern of stone and light, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself a small, weary smile. The final step was the interior. She built a small stone hearth and chimney against the west wall, not for primary heating, but for cooking and for supplemental warmth during long, sunless stretches. The chimney flue was designed with a damper, allowing her to control the airflow precisely. She built a raised platform at the northern end for her bed, placing it against the wall that was thermally bonded to the cliff face. The floor remained bare earth, which was essential to the design. It was the conduit for the stable geothermal heat to enter the living space. She moved in her few possessions, a bedroll, a cast-iron pot, Thomas's books, and her grandfather's journals. On December 1st, with a foot of snow already on the ground and the temperature hovering near zero, Ilara moved into her subterranean home for good. She sealed the insulated door, a heavy wooden frame packed with dried moss and covered in canvas. She lit a small, economical fire in the hearth to cook her evening meal of dried beans and jerky. The air inside was cool, but not cold. It was a stable 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the temperature was dropping rapidly, and the wind had begun to howl. In town, the citizens of Providence Falls huddled around their roaring fires, feeding cords of precious wood into their stoves to fight the encroaching chill that seeped through the walls of their tall, proud, and very cold timber houses. They believed they were prepared. They had no idea what was coming. For the first 2 weeks of December, life in the sunken house, which Ilara had come to call the Walipini after a term from her grandfather's notes, settled into a quiet, sustainable rhythm. The design worked even better than she had dared to hope. On clear, sunny days, the interior temperature would rise to a comfortable 65 or even 70 degrees by mid-afternoon. The stone walls and the packed earth floor would absorb this heat, acting as a massive thermal battery. As night fell and the outside world plunged into sub-zero temperatures, the stored warmth would slowly radiate back into the living space, keeping the ambient temperature from dropping below 50 degrees, even by dawn. She used her small hearth only for an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening, consuming a tiny fraction of the firewood a conventional cabin would require. She spent her days organizing her remaining $20 worth of provisions, reading, and making small improvements. She built shelves into the stone walls, carved a small root cellar even deeper into the northern wall, where the cold was most profound, and even devised a system for melting snow for water that used a dark-painted metal sheet placed outside on the glass to draw the sun's heat. Her existence was solitary, but not lonely. The quiet hum of the earth, the play of light through the glass, the solid, unyielding presence of the stone, these were her companions. She was living not in defiance of nature, but in partnership with it. Meanwhile, the town of Providence Falls was beginning to feel the winter's bite in earnest. The cold was relentless, a siege that never lifted. The initial stocks of firewood were dwindling faster than anticipated, Mr. Blackwood's mill had closed for the season, and the price of seasoned cordwood at Mr. Gable's store had doubled. A deep, grumbling anxiety began to permeate the town. The men who had laughed at Alara's folly now spoke of the winter in hushed, worried tones. They would see the thin, almost invisible plume of smoke from her chimney for a short time each day and shake their heads in pity. They imagined her freezing in the dark, huddled over a pathetic fire, surely regretting her stubborn pride. The irony was a chasm they could not begin to comprehend. On December 18th, 1876, the sky turned a strange, bruised yellow-gray. The wind died down completely, creating an unnerving silence. The air grew heavy, and an odd pressure could be felt in the ears. Alara, stepping outside to gather a bucket of snow, felt it immediately. She had read of this phenomenon in the journals. It was the precursor to a blizzard of historic magnitude, a white hurricane, as the old texts called it. She checked the seal on her door, packed extra moss into any conceivable crack, and brought her remaining firewood inside, stacking it neatly by the hearth. She was ready. The storm began not with a flurry, but with an onslaught. The sky opened, and a vertical wall of snow descended upon the world, driven by a resurrected wind that shrieked like a banshee. Within an hour, visibility was reduced to 0. Within 3 hours, the snow was piling in massive drifts against the north-facing walls of the town's houses. The temperature plummeted, a free fall from 10 degrees above 0 to 10, then 20, then 30 degrees below. Inside the Wallapini, Alara was an island of calm in a sea of meteorological fury. The wind howled and screamed high above her, its force broken by the ravine and the massive berm she had built. The snow, far from being a threat, was an ally. It began to pile up on her glass roof, and at first she was concerned it would block the light. But her grandfather had accounted for this. The heat escaping through the glass, minimal as it was just enough to melt the bottom layer of snow, creating a thin film of water that allowed the accumulating mass to slide off the 30-degree slope. More importantly, the snow piled deep around the exposed parts of her dwelling, burying it completely. It was the final layer of insulation, a thick, downy blanket provided by the storm itself. The world outside had become an Arctic hell, but inside her shelter, the temperature held steady at a comfortable 52 degrees. For 3 days, the blizzard raged without pause. In Providence Falls, the situation deteriorated from uncomfortable to desperate, and then to deadly. The town's tall, proud houses, so admired by Alderman Croft, became death traps. The ferocious wind tore at their siding, infiltrated every crack, and overwhelmed their defenses. The laws of thermodynamics, which the council had dismissed as fanciful theories, were now asserting themselves with lethal force. Heat was being sucked out of the buildings at a catastrophic rate. Families were forced to burn anything they could find: furniture, books, floorboards. Still, the cold crept in. Frost formed on the inside of the walls. Water froze in buckets just feet from roaring fires. The first to perish was an elderly couple whose firewood ran out on the second night. Then, a family with a newborn child succumbed in their poorly built homestead on the edge of town. The houses were failing. The conventional wisdom, the way it has always been done, was leading them to their doom. On the 4th day, December 22nd, the wind finally lessened, though the snow continued to fall heavily. In the relative quiet, a new sound could be heard: the frantic ringing of the town's emergency bell, a desperate, clanging plea for help. But no one could answer. Every home was an isolated prison, its occupants fighting a losing battle for survival. It was Alderman Croft who finally broke. His grand house, the largest in town, was now an icebox. His wife and 2 children were huddled under a mountain of blankets, their breathing shallow, their lips blue. They had burned the dining room table, and now only the chairs remained. He looked at their faces, etched with fear and cold, and the rigid certainty that had defined his entire life finally shattered. He remembered the girl, the mad girl in her ditch, the badger in her hole. He remembered her talk of the earth's warmth. Getting there was an odyssey. He, Mr. Blackwood, and Mr. Gable, whose own homes were failing just as spectacularly, banded together. It took them 2 hours to clear a path from their doors to the street, and another 3 to struggle the 2 miles to the Grayback Ravine. They were waist-deep, sometimes chest-deep, in snow. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that clawed at their lungs and stole the life from their extremities. They were guided only by a desperate, illogical hope. When they reached the ravine's edge, they saw nothing. The world was a uniform, undulating sea of white. The ravine itself seemed to have vanished, filled to the brim with snow. For a moment, they despaired. They had been fools. The girl was surely dead, buried long ago. Then, Blackwood saw it. A small, dark rectangle on the western side of the ravine. A wisp of smoke, impossibly, rising from a small stone chimney that barely cleared the snowpack. They half slid, half fell down the slope, stumbling towards the source of the smoke. They found the top of Ilara's door, its east-facing orientation having saved it from the deepest drifts. Croft, his face a mask of frozen tears and desperation, pounded on the wood with his gloved fists. "Help!" he croaked, his voice raw. "For the love of God, help us!" Inside, Ilara heard the frantic pounding. She was sitting at her small table, reading by the light of a single candle and the diffuse glow filtering through the snow-covered glass. She was warm, safe, and had just finished a meal of hot soup. She moved to the door and, with some effort, pushed it open against the snow. The sight that greeted her was pitiable. 3 of the most powerful men in town, the very men who had mocked and dismissed her, stood before her, covered in snow, their beards encrusted with ice, their faces gaunt with terror and exhaustion. They looked like ghosts. Alderman Croft fell to his knees. "Please, miss," he begged, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Our families, we are freezing. The wood is gone. We were wrong. We were arrogant fools. Can you help us?" Ilara looked at them. She saw no triumph in their broken pride, no satisfaction in their desperation. She felt only a deep, profound sadness for the cost of their ignorance. She remembered their condescending laughter, their smug pronouncements. She could have turned them away. She could have left them to the fate they had so confidently assured her would be her own. But her grandfather's journals were not just about thermodynamics and engineering. They were about wisdom, and true wisdom was inseparable from compassion. "Get your families," she said, her voice calm and even. "Bring them here, quickly." The rescue was a slow, arduous process. Ilara gave the men hot broth and let them warm themselves by her hearth for a few precious minutes before sending them back. It took 6 trips, a chain of shivering men, women, and children struggling through the snow, to bring the 12 survivors from the 3 families to the Wallapini. As each person entered the shelter, their reaction was the same: utter, stunned disbelief. They stepped out of a world of lethal, screaming cold and into a space of quiet, gentle, life-sustaining warmth. The air was still and dry. The light was soft. It felt like a miracle. They filled her home, their bodies crowding the earthen floor. Ilara shared her provisions, making a large pot of stew that filled the space with the scent of hope. The children, who had been on the verge of freezing to death, were soon asleep, their first peaceful rest in days. The adults sat in silence, wrapped in blankets and the incredible reality of their salvation. They looked at the stone walls, the glass ceiling, and at the young woman who had built it all. They were looking at a truth they had refused to see. The blizzard finally broke on Christmas morning. The sun rose into a crystal-clear sky, illuminating a world transformed, a landscape of profound and terrible beauty. When the survivors emerged from the Walipini, they saw the full extent of the devastation. The town of Providence Falls was crippled. Many houses were damaged, their roofs collapsed under the weight of the snow. Worse, as the survivors began the grim task of digging out, they discovered the true cost of the storm. 17 people had not survived. 17 lives had been lost to the cold, in homes built according to the proper, God-fearing way. Not one of them had lost a family member because they lacked firewood. They had lost them because their homes were fundamentally flawed, designed to fight the cold instead of working with the earth. Not one had burned through their wood supply because the winter was unexpectedly harsh. They had burned through it because their structures were thermal sieves, leaking precious heat into the uncaring sky. And not one of the men who now stood in the ruins of their town, saved by the very girl they had scorned, would ever again admit they knew better. In the weeks that followed, Ilara Vance's Walipini became a place of pilgrimage. People came to see the hole in the ground that had weathered the great white hurricane of '76. They came to feel the warmth, to understand the principles. Ilara, no longer the town outcast, became its sage. She did not gloat or preach. She simply answered their questions, sharing the knowledge from her grandfather's journals. She explained the concept of thermal mass, of passive solar gain, of geothermal stability. She used the simple, declarative sentences of undeniable fact. Alderman Croft, a humbled and broken man, publicly ceded all salvaged town materials to her. Mr. Blackwood offered her a lifetime supply of lumber, which she politely declined for her own needs, but accepted on behalf of the town for rebuilding efforts. Mr. Gable stocked his store with pane glass and linseed putty, and began telling customers not about its cost, but about its value. The following spring, the rebuilding of Providence Falls began. But the new homes were not the tall, proud structures of before. Under Ilara's guidance, they were built differently. They were built with stone foundations dug deep into the earth. They were oriented to the south. They incorporated large, insulated windows and principles of thermal mass. They were building not just houses, but systems for living. Systems that respected the unyielding laws of nature. Ilara Vance lived in her sunken home for the rest of her long life. She never remarried, but she was never alone. She became the quiet, unshakable center of a community reborn from tragedy, a living testament to the simple, profound truth that the deepest wisdom is often found not by standing tall in loud defiance of the world, but by digging quietly into the earth and listening to its ancient, steady heartbeat. Her home was not a ditch or a hole. It was a sanctuary, a classroom, a monument. It was vindication, built of stone and earth and light, a structure whose warmth was a legacy, a lesson paid for in the harshest currency, but learned at last for the ages. The stone walls, once a subject of mockery, had done more than keep one person warm. They had kept an entire community's future from freezing.